Haven's Rest was a neutral station that floated in the space between empires, and its corridors bustled with species from every corner of the galaxy, seeking refuge from the politics that plagued the wider universe. Yuna had never seen such diversity, and she walked through the station with wonder in her eyes as she observed beings who would never have been permitted within Solari territory. 3 weeks had passed since their escape from Varus 7, and Do-hyun's wound had healed well under Jiho's careful attention. He walked beside her now with his arm in a light sling, and he smiled at her amazement with warm amusement. "You look like a child seeing the ocean for the first time," he observed. "I feel like one," Yuna admitted. "The Empire kept us isolated from other species, and we were taught that aliens were inferior beings unworthy of our attention. And now," Do-hyun prompted, "now I see how much we missed," Yuna said softly. "All these lives and cultures and stories that we ignored because of arrogance." They found a quiet observation deck where they could watch ships come and go from the station, and Yuna leaned against the viewport with contentment she had never expected to feel. "Jiho told me that news of our escape has spread across the independent networks," she said. "Apparently, the story of a human protecting a Solari princess has captured significant attention." "I noticed," Do-hyun replied with slight discomfort. "Several journalists have tried to contact me, and I have declined all their requests." "You do not want fame?" Yuna asked. "I want peace," Do-hyun corrected. "Fame is the opposite of peace," Yuna laughed, and the sound surprised her because she could not remember the last time she had laughed genuinely. A chime announced a visitor, and Jiho entered the observation deck with a serious expression. "The coalition of minor species has sent representatives," she announced. "They want to meet with Princess Yuna." Do-hyun immediately tensed, and his protective instincts flared visibly. "What do they want?" he asked. "They want to offer me asylum," Yuna answered, "and possibly political support, because my survival embarrasses my brother and creates uncertainty about his legitimacy." She had received the initial communication 2 days ago, and she had been considering her response carefully since then. "They see value in me," Yuna continued. "A living symbol of imperial cruelty, a princess who was discarded and survived. A potential rallying point for those who oppose my brother's rule." "What do you want?" Do-hyun asked, and his question cut through the politics to the heart of the matter. Yuna turned from the viewport and faced him directly. "I want to meet with them," she said, "but I will not leave you." Surprise flickered across Do-hyun's face. "The coalition is offering you a chance to rebuild your life," he said. "Perhaps even to reclaim your position and challenge your brother someday. And these are opportunities that I cannot provide." "You have provided something more valuable," Yuna replied, and she moved closer to him until they stood face to face. "You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me kindness without expecting anything in return. And you taught me that power is meaningless compared to genuine connection." "Yuna," Do-hyun began, but she continued speaking. "My people believe we cannot survive alone," she said, "and that belief is true. But the Empire interpreted it as weakness and used our need for connection to control. Used through fear of isolation." She reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had pulled her from despair and carried her to safety. "You showed me a different interpretation," Yuna continued. "You showed me that needing others is not weakness but strength, because it means we must be brave enough to trust and vulnerable enough to accept help. The coalition representatives are waiting." Jiho reminded them gently. "Let them wait," Yuna said without looking away from Do-hyun. "I need to finish saying this." Do-hyun nodded, and his eyes held an intensity that made her heart race. "I will meet with the coalition," Yuna declared, "and I will accept their asylum and use whatever influence I can build to help those who suffer under my brother's rule. But I will do all of this with you beside me." "As your protector?" Do-hyun asked. "As my partner," Yuna corrected. as my friend and my family and whoever else you choose to be, because I do not want to face the future without you." Do-hyun was silent for a long moment, and Yuna felt fear creep into her chest as she waited for his response. Then he smiled, and it was the same gentle expression she had first seen in that small room beneath the mining station. "I told you once that humans form bonds of loyalty and friendship," he said. "And I want you to know that my bond with you is the strongest I've ever felt. Then you will stay with me." Yuna asked. "I will stay with you," Do-hyun confirmed. "For as long as you want me." Yuna's bioluminescence blazed with joy, and she embraced him carefully to avoid his injured shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." "Thank you," Do-hyun replied. "For giving me something worth protecting." They stood together in the light of distant stars, and the universe seemed smaller and warmer than it had before. An hour later, Yuna met with the coalition representatives, and Do-hyun stood at her side throughout the discussion. She negotiated with skill that surprised even herself, securing not only asylum but resources to help other Sailari who had been exiled or oppressed by the current regime. The representatives looked at Do-hyun with curiosity and respect, and one of them finally asked the question that seemed to be on all their minds. "Why did you help her?" the ambassador inquired. "You had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and your actions make no sense from a rational perspective." Do-hyun considered the question, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Because helping others is what makes us human," he said. "Not our aggression or our survival instincts or our capacity for violence, but our ability to see suffering and choose to ease it." The ambassador studied him with new understanding, and something shifted in the way the coalition viewed humanity from that moment forward. As they left the meeting chamber, Yuna paused at a large viewport that showed the expanse of space beyond the station. "My people believe we cannot survive alone," she said, repeating the words that had haunted her since childhood. Do-hyun stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "They were right," Yuna continued, "but they never understood that family can be chosen, that bonds can form across species and cultures, and all the barriers we build between ourselves." She looked at him with eyes that glowed violet in the starlight. "You taught me that," she said softly. "We taught each other." Do-hyun replied. Outside the viewport, ships carrying 1,000 different species moved through the darkness between stars, each one a small light against the infinite void. And in that moment, standing beside the human who had saved her life and changed her heart, Yuna understood that hope was not something given by circumstances, but something created through courage and connection. The galaxy remained vast and dangerous and full of those who would use power to crush the vulnerable, but she was no longer alone, and she would never be alone again. That was enough, and that was everything. The cave system beneath the northern ridge of Varus 7 had been carved by ancient volcanic activity, and the tunnels twisted through the rock like the veins of some enormous sleeping creature. Do-hyun led Yuna through the darkness with confidence, born from months of exploration, and he had mapped these caves during his off-duty hours simply because he liked knowing all possible routes of escape. Now that preparation was saving their lives. "Imperial ships entered the system 3 hours ago," Do-hyun said as they paused to rest in a small chamber. "They landed troops at the station, and Vance is cooperating fully with them." "How do you know this?" Yuna asked, her breathing still heavy from their flight. "Jiho has access to communication intercepts," Do-hyun explained. "She is tracking the enemy movements and relaying information to us." Yuna marveled at the network of loyalty that surrounded this human, and she wondered how one person could inspire such dedication from others. "The soldiers will search these caves," she said, and fear crept into her voice despite her efforts to control it. "They will try," Do-hyun agreed. but I know this terrain better than anyone, and I have prepared several surprises for anyone who follows us. They move deeper into the tunnel system, and Do-Yoon occasionally stopped to activate devices he had hidden during previous explorations. Noisemakers, he explained when Yuna asked. They will trigger if anyone passes by and create sounds in distant tunnels, leading the search parties in wrong directions. You planned for this. Yuna realized with surprise. I planned for the possibility of needing to disappear, Do-Hyun corrected. I did not know the circumstances, but I knew that one day I might need to vanish quickly. Hours passed as they navigated the underground labyrinth, and several times they heard the distant echoes of pursuit. But Do-Hyun's misdirection kept the soldiers far from their actual position. During a quiet moment in a chamber lit by phosphorescent minerals, Yuna watched Do-Hyun check his weapons and supplies with methodical precision. You move like a predator, she observed. Dangerous and controlled. Do-Hyun looked up at her with a slight smile. I was trained for combat since I was 18 years old, he said. Fighting is something I understand deeply. Yet you did not kill any of the people at the station, Yuna noted. You could have fought your way out instead of sneaking through tunnels. I could have, Do-Hyun agreed. But those people were not my enemies. They were just workers following orders from a corrupt commander. And killing them would have been wrong. Yuna felt something warm spread through her chest at those words. In the Empire, she said softly, strength is measured by willingness to destroy anything that stands in your path. But you have strength, and yet you choose restraint. Killing is easy, Do-Hyun replied. Any fool with a weapon can kill, but knowing when not to kill requires wisdom. And that is the harder path. She thought about her brother Talon, who had murdered dozens of rivals to claim his throne. And she realized that by Do-Hyun's measure, her brother was weak, despite all his power. A distant explosion echoed through the tunnels, and Do-Hyun immediately moved to a defensive position. One of my traps, he said. The soldiers found a dummy passage, and that blast will have sealed it behind them. You did that without hurting anyone. Yuna asked. The explosion was calibrated to collapse empty rock, Do-Hyun confirmed. No one was close enough to be injured, but they will waste hours clearing the debris. They continued moving through the caves. And with each passing hour, Yuna's admiration for this human grew stronger. He anticipated problems before they occurred. He protected her without treating her as helpless. And he never once complained about the danger he had accepted on her behalf. As they rested again in another chamber, Yuna found herself speaking words she had not planned to say. I have formed a survival bond with you, she admitted quietly. Do-Hyun looked at her with curiosity, but not alarm. What does that mean? He asked. Among my people, Yuna explained. A survival bond forms when one person becomes essential to another's continued existence. And it is not something we choose consciously, but something that happens when we find genuine connection. And you have formed this bond with me. Do-Hyun said. Yes, Yuna confirmed. And vulnerability filled her voice. My bioluminescence grows stronger when you are near, and I feel hope that I thought I had lost forever. And these are the signs of a bond forming. She waited for him to react with discomfort or rejection. But instead, he simply nodded thoughtfully. Humans form bonds too, he said. We call it loyalty or friendship or love. And it means we become responsible for each other's well-being. You do not find it strange, Yuna asked, that an alien is bonded with you? Do-Hyun shook his head. I find it meaningful, he replied. And I want you to know that I feel responsible for you, not because you are a princess or because helping you serve some purpose, but because you matter as a person. Yuna's skin blazed with light, brighter than it had glowed since before her exile, and she felt tears sliding down her cheeks. No one has ever said that to me, she whispered. Then everyone else was wrong. Do-yoon said firmly. A communication signal interrupted the moment, and Do-yoon activated his receiver. "We are approaching the extraction point," a voice reported. "ETA 20 minutes, but we are detecting Imperial fighters in orbit." "Understood," Do-yoon replied. "We will be there." He stood and offered his hand to Yuna, and she took it without hesitation. "The exit is 1 kilometer ahead," he said. "But the last stretch is open ground with no cover. Then we run," Yuna said. And she meant it as a statement of resolve rather than a question. They moved quickly through the final tunnel, and when they emerged into the twilight of Varus 7, they could see a small ship descending toward a flat area of rock, but they could also see a squad of Imperial soldiers between them and landing zone. "Stay behind me," Do-yoon commanded, and his voice had shifted into something harder and colder. He moved with terrifying efficiency, using the terrain for cover and closing distance with the soldiers before they fully realized the threat. Yuna watched in amazement as he disabled 3 soldiers with precise non-lethal strikes, moving through them like water through stones. A 4th soldier raised his weapon toward Yuna, and Do-yoon threw himself into the line of fire without hesitation. The energy blast caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. "Do-yoon!" Yuna screamed, and she ran to his side without thinking of her own safety. The ship had landed now, and its crew emerged with weapons blazing, driving back the remaining soldiers with covering fire. "Get him on board," a woman shouted, and Yuna recognized the voice as Jiho from the communications. Together, they lifted Do-yoon and carried him toward the ship. And Yuna's tears fell freely as she saw the blood soaking through his uniform. "You fool," she whispered to his unconscious form. "You wonderful, impossible fool." The ship lifted off just as more Imperial forces arrived at the scene, and the pilot pushed the engines to maximum as they fled toward the edge of the system. Yuna held Do-yoon's hand as Jiho worked to treat his wound, and she poured all her hope and all her newfound will to survive into the grip of her fingers. He had taken a blast meant for her, and that sacrifice meant more than any crown or kingdom ever could. "He is stable," Jiho announced finally. "The wound is serious but not fatal, and he will recover." Yuna collapsed with relief, and her bioluminescence blazed like a small sun in the darkness of the ship. Outside the viewport, the stars welcomed them into the void, carrying them away from death and towards something that felt remarkably like hope. 2 days passed in the small quarters beneath the mining station, and during that time, Yuna began to see the universe in entirely new ways. Do-yoon had transformed his living space to accommodate her, giving up his bed while he slept on a thin mat in the corner. And he never complained or made her feel like a burden. They talked for hours each day, sharing stories from their vastly different lives. And Yuna discovered that conversation with this human was unlike anything she had experienced before. In the Imperial court, every word carried hidden meaning, and every interaction was a game of power and manipulation. But Do-yoon spoke with simple honesty that felt revolutionary. He told her about Earth, the planet where humans had evolved, and she listened with fascination as he described oceans that covered most of the surface and mountains that touched the clouds, and forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. "Your world sounds beautiful," she said, and she meant it genuinely. "It can be," Do-yoon agreed, "but it can also be harsh and dangerous. And many species in the galaxy consider it a death world because of the challenges it presents." "Is that why humans are so strong?" Yuna asked. "Because you evolved in such a difficult environment." Do-yoon considered the question carefully before answering. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe strength is something we learned because we had no other choice." And surviving Earth required adaptation and determination and the willingness to keep fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. Yuna found herself thinking about those words long after the conversation ended, and she began to wonder if human resilience came not from aggression, but from something deeper. On the third day, Do-hyun returned from a supply run with a troubled expression, and Yuna knew immediately that something had changed. Vance contacted the Celari Empire, he said without preamble. Imperial ships will be here within 2 days. The words hit Yuna like a physical blow, and her bioluminescence dimmed sharply as fear flooded through her. "They will kill me," she whispered. "My brother cannot allow me to live, because even in exile I represent a threat to his legitimacy." "I know," Do-hyun said, and his voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. "That is why we are leaving tonight." Yuna stared at him with disbelief. And once again, this human had shattered her expectations. "You would abandon your position here?" she asked. "Your employment and your security, you would give all of that up for me?" "Yes," Do-hyun answered simply. "But why?" Yuna pressed, and the question burst out of her with desperate confusion. "I have nothing to offer you, no power or wealth or influence. I am worthless to everyone in the galaxy. So why would you sacrifice anything for my sake?" Do-hyun moved closer and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and his presence felt steady and reassuring in a way she could not explain. "You are not worthless," he said firmly, "and you do not need to offer me anything because helping you is not a transaction." "I do not understand," Yuna admitted, and her voice trembled slightly. "In my culture," Do-hyun explained, "we believe that protecting those who cannot protect themselves is a duty, not a bargain. And the value of a person is not measured by what they can give us in return." Yuna felt tears forming in her eyes, and she did not try to hide them. "No one has ever said such things to me," she whispered. "In the Empire, we are taught that all relationships are exchanges, and those without power exist only to serve those who have it." "That sounds like a lonely way to live," Do-hyun observed quietly. "It is," Yuna agreed, and the admission felt like releasing a weight she had carried her entire life. They spent the remaining hours preparing for their escape, and Do-hyun showed her the route they would take through the station's maintenance tunnels to reach an emergency hangar on the far side of the complex. "I have contacted some old friends," he explained. "Former soldiers who now work as freelance rescuers, and they will meet us at extraction coordinates outside the station." "You have friends who would help you with something like this?" Yuna asked with wonder. "I have friends who believe in doing what is right," Do-hyun corrected, "and they trust me to make good decisions about when to ask for help." As night fell according to station time, they gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to move. But before they left, Yuna stopped and turned to face Do-hyun with an expression of vulnerability that she had never shown anyone. "May I ask you something personal?" she said softly. "Of course." Do-hyun replied. "When you found me on that ridge," Yuna began, "what made you decide to help me instead of following your protocol and reporting my presence?" Do-hyun was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of memory. "I lost my entire squad 6 years ago," he said. 12 soldiers who trusted me to lead them, and they died because I followed orders instead of following my instincts." Yuna listened without interrupting, and she could see the pain that still lived behind his eyes. "After that I made a promise to myself," Do-hyun continued. "I promised that I would never let protocol or orders or fear prevent me from helping someone who needed help. And I needed help." Yuna said softly. "Yes," Do-hyun confirmed. "And I needed to be the person who could give it." They looked at each other in the dim light of the small room, and something passed between them that neither could name, but both could feel. "We should go," Do-hyun finally said, and his voice was gentle but urgent. They moved through the maintenance tunnels in careful silence, and Yuna followed close behind Do-hyun as he navigated the dark passages with practiced ease. Twice they heard voices and had to press themselves against the walls until the danger passed. And each time Do-hyun positioned himself between her and any potential threat. They reached the emergency hangar just as an alarm began blaring throughout the station. And red lights flashed in warning as Vance's voice echoed through the speakers. "Attention, all personnel," the commander announced. "Sergeant Park and the alien fugitive are attempting to flee the station, and anyone who assists them will be charged with treason against the mining consortium. We need to move faster," Do-hyun said. And he grabbed Yuna's hand and pulled her toward the hangar door. They burst through the exit and into the cold air of Varus 7, and the barren landscape stretched before them like an ocean of gray stone. "The extraction point is 2 kilometers north," Do-hyun said. "Can you run?" "I can try," Yuna answered. And she meant it with every fiber of her being. They ran together across the rocky terrain. And behind them, the station erupted with activity as security teams mobilized to pursue them. Yuna's lungs burned and her legs ached. But she kept moving because stopping meant death, and Do-hyun's hand in hers gave her strength she did not know she possessed. Above them, the stars wheeled silently, and somewhere among them Imperial ships were racing toward this forgotten moon with orders to silence a discarded princess forever. But Yuna was no longer alone, and that simple fact changed everything. Yuna woke to warmth and softness, and for a brief moment she thought she was back in her chambers at the Imperial Palace. But then memory crashed over her like a cold wave, and she remembered everything. She sat up slowly, her body aching but stronger than before. And she looked around the small room that had become her unexpected sanctuary. The human was not present, but she could see evidence of his attention everywhere. Fresh water beside the bed, a plate of simple food that looked carefully prepared, and additional blankets that had been placed over her during the night. She did not understand any of this, and her confusion grew stronger with each passing moment. The Sailari Empire had taught her many things about humans during her education, and none of those lessons matched what she was experiencing now. Humans were dangerous, her tutors had insisted, and they were aggressive and unpredictable, and driven by violent impulses that made them threats to civilized species throughout the galaxy. They had emerged from a death world, a planet so hostile that survival required constant struggle. And that origin had shaped them into warriors who knew nothing of peace or compassion. Yet the human who had found her had shown nothing but gentleness, and his actions made no sense within the framework she had been given. The door opened and Do-hyun entered carrying additional supplies. And he paused when he saw her sitting upright and alert. "You look better," he said. And there was something in his voice that sounded like genuine relief. "Your skin patterns are brighter than yesterday." Yuna looked down at her hands and saw that he was right. And the bioluminescent marks that traced her veins glowed with more intensity than they had since her exile began. "I do not understand," she admitted, and the words came out before she could stop them. "Why are you helping me?" Do-hyun set down his supplies and pulled a chair closer to the bed, sitting at a respectful distance that did not feel threatening. "I told you yesterday," he said simply. "You needed help, but I am Sailari," Yuna pressed. "Our empires have been rivals for centuries, and my people have never shown kindness to humans. So why would you show kindness to me?" Do-hyun was quiet for a moment, and she watched his face as he considered her question with obvious thoughtfulness. "I have learned many things during my years as a soldier," he finally said, "and one of the most important lessons is that individuals are not their governments. And suffering does not care about political boundaries." Yuna felt something shift in her chest at those words, and she recognized it as the beginning of hope, even though she tried to suppress it. "What is your name?" Do-hyun asked. "I have been calling you the woman in my head, but that seems disrespectful." "Yuna," she answered after a brief hesitation. "Yuna Kale Sora." She watched his face carefully for recognition. And she saw the moment when he processed her family name and understood its significance. Kale Sora, he repeated slowly. That is the Imperial family. Yes, Yuna confirmed. And she waited for his attitude to change now that he knew her true identity. So you are royalty, Do-Yun said. And his tone remained exactly the same as before. Neither more impressed nor more suspicious. That explains the quality of your clothes. But it does not explain why you were dying alone on this moon. Yuna found herself telling him everything. And the words flowed out of her like water breaking through a dam. She told him about the succession war and her brother's victory and the exile that was meant to be her death sentence. And she explained how her species required connection to survive, and how isolation would kill her as surely as any poison. Do-Yun listened without interrupting, and his expression grew darker as she described the cruelty of her sentence. Your own brother did this to you, he said when she finished, and there was anger in his voice that surprised her. He is the emperor now, Yuna said with resignation. He can do whatever he wishes. Being able to do something does not make it right, Do-Hyun replied firmly. And she saw conviction in his eyes that seemed unshakable. He stood and moved to a communication terminal in the corner of the room. And she watched as he contacted someone on a private channel. Jiho, he said when the connection established. I need information about Cellari biology, specifically about their survival requirements and what happens when they are isolated. The voice that responded was female and sounded amused. And Yuna gathered that this Jiho person was someone Do-Yun trusted. Why do you need to know about Cellari biology? Jiho asked. Did you adopt an alien princess or something? Something like that, Do-Hyun admitted. And Yuna felt a strange flutter in her chest at his casual acceptance of responsibility for her well-being. The conversation continued for several minutes. And Yuna learned that Jiho was a medic who had served with Do-Yun during his military career. By the end of the call, Do-Hyun had a clear understanding of what Yuna needed to survive. Meaningful social bonds, regular interaction, and the sense of being valued by others. So loneliness will literally kill you, Do-Hyun said after ending the call. And he shook his head slowly. That is one of the saddest things I've ever heard. My people evolved in dense communities, Yuna explained. We were never meant to exist alone. Before Do-Hyun could respond, a harsh buzzing filled the room, and he moved to another terminal with sudden tension in his body. Sergeant Park, a cold voice demanded, and Yuna recognized the tone of someone accustomed to authority. I have received reports that you brought an unauthorized alien onto this station, and I am ordering you to deliver that asset to my office immediately. Do-Hyun's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. With respect, Commander Vance, she is not an asset, and she is a person who nearly died on our doorstep. I do not care what she is, Vance replied, and greed was evident in every word. An alien of unknown origin has potential value, and I intend to determine exactly how much value before deciding what to do with her. No, Do-Hyun said simply. There was a pause on the other end of the line. And when Vance spoke again, his voice had turned dangerous. That sounded like insubordination, Sergeant. And I suggest you reconsider your position very carefully. My position is that I will not hand over a vulnerable person to be exploited. Do-Hyun replied. You can reconsider your position, Commander. The line went dead, and Do-Hyun turned to face Yuna with a grim expression. We may have a problem, he said. Yuna stared at him with wide eyes, and she could not comprehend what had just happened. You defied your commander, she whispered. For me, a stranger from a rival species. I defied a greedy man who wanted to use you, Do-Hyun corrected. There is a difference. But why? Yuna pressed. And she needed to understand this human who broke every expectation she had ever held. Do-Hyun knelt beside the bed so their eyes were level. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle. because I have seen what happens when people treat others as objects instead of people," he said. "And I decided a long time ago that I would not be part of that kind of cruelty." Yuna felt her bioluminescent patterns pulse brighter, and warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "Thank you," she said. And the words felt insufficient, but they were all she had, though Yoon smiled. And it was the first time she had seen that expression on his face. "Do not thank me yet," he warned. "We still need to figure out how to keep you safe." Outside the room, in the corridors of the station, Commander Vance was already making calls to contacts who would pay handsomely for information about a lost Selari princess. The Imperial transport ship descended through the thin atmosphere of Varus 7 without ceremony or care, and the soldiers inside moved with cold efficiency as they prepared to complete their final task. Princess Yuna. Kale Sora stood in the cargo hold with her wrists bound, her silver blue skin showing the faintest tremor of fear that she fought desperately to hide from her captors. She was the third daughter of Emperor Kael'Mora, and 3 days ago she had been a member of the most powerful family in the Selari Empire. But now she was nothing more than discarded cargo. The succession war had ended badly for her faction, and her eldest brother Talon had claimed the throne with blood and betrayal, executing those who opposed him and exiling those too insignificant to kill publicly. Yuna fell into the second category, and her brother had chosen a punishment far crueler than a quick death. The Selari were a species that required connection to survive, and their bodies produced bioluminescent patterns that reflected their emotional and physical health, glowing bright when they thrived and dimming when they suffered. Isolation was fatal to her kind, and everyone in the Empire knew that an exiled Selari would wither and die within weeks without meaningful bonds to sustain them. The transport landed with a heavy thud, and the cargo doors opened to reveal a barren landscape of gray rock and perpetual twilight. "Get out," the lead soldier commanded, and he did not even look at her as he spoke. Yuna stepped forward on unsteady legs, and the cold air of the moon hit her immediately, seeping through her thin ceremonial robes that offered no protection against the harsh environment. "My brother sends his regards," the soldier said with a cruel smile. And then the doors closed and the transport lifted off, leaving her completely alone on the surface of a moon that existed at the edge of known space. She stood there for a long moment, watching the ship disappear into the dark sky. And then she began to walk, because standing still meant accepting death. The landscape of Varus 7 stretched endlessly in every direction, and Yuna had no idea where she was going or what she hoped to find. But her feet carried her forward anyway. Hours passed, and then a full day, and her bioluminescent patterns grew dimmer with each step as loneliness and despair consumed her from within. She had never been alone before. Not truly, and even in her lowest moments at the palace there had always been servants or guards or other members of the court nearby. Now there was nothing but silence and rock, and the distant stars that watched her struggle without offering any comfort. On the second day, her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed against a boulder, her breathing shallow and her skin showing barely any light at all. "This is how I die," she thought, and there was almost peace in that realization, because at least the suffering would end. She closed her eyes and waited for the darkness to take her completely. Sergeant Dolian Park had been working security on Varus 7 for 8 months, and he had learned to appreciate the quiet predictability of the mining outpost. The work was simple, and the pay was decent. And most importantly, nobody asked questions about his past or expected him to be anything other than competent and reliable. He conducted his perimeter checks twice daily, walking the same routes and scanning the same horizons. And the routine had become almost meditative in its repetition. But today, something broke that pattern. And Do-hyun stopped mid-stride when his scanner detected a life form, approximately 200 meters from the eastern boundary. "That cannot be right," he muttered, checking the readings again, and the scanner confirmed what it had shown before. A single biological entity showing weak vital signs. He adjusted his path and moved toward the signal, his hand resting on his weapon out of habit rather than genuine concern. And when he crested the ridge, he saw something that made him pause completely. An alien woman lay crumpled against a boulder, her silver-blue skin barely visible in the dim light of the moon. And she looked so fragile that he thought she might already be dead. Do-hyun approached slowly, and when he got close enough to see her face, he noticed the faint patterns on her skin that flickered weakly like dying embers. He recognized her species from his military training, Silari, one of the elder races that had dominated galactic politics for thousands of years. And finding one here on this forgotten moon made absolutely no sense. Protocol demanded that he report this to Station Commander Vance immediately. But something stopped him from reaching for his communicator. She looked broken in a way that went beyond physical injury. And Do-hyun had seen that look before in the eyes of refugees and survivors. During his years of service, he made a decision in that moment. And it was not a logical decision, but it felt like the right one. Do-hyun knelt beside her and checked her pulse, finding it weak but present. And then he carefully lifted her into his arms and began carrying her back toward the outpost. She weighed almost nothing, and her body felt cold against his chest. And he moved quickly through the rocky terrain, while keeping her as stable as possible. The lower levels of the outpost contained his private quarters, and Do-hyun had chosen that location specifically because it allowed him to avoid the other workers most of the time. He brought her inside and laid her on his bed, covering her with thermal blankets and activating the heating system to raise the room temperature. For several hours, he sat beside her, monitoring her condition and wondering what circumstances had brought a Solari to this desolate place. Her skin patterns flickered occasionally, and each time they did, he felt a small surge of relief that she was still fighting to survive. Finally, near midnight by station time, her eyes opened. They were a deep violet color, and they widened with terror when they focused on his face. And she scrambled backward against the wall with a gasp of fear. "Easy," Do-hyun said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. And he spoke slowly in Galactic Common, hoping she would understand. "You are safe here. I found you outside and brought you in to recover." She stared at him with those frightened eyes, and he could see her mind working as she processed what she was seeing. "You are human," she whispered, and her voice carried a weight of fear and confusion that told him everything he needed to know about what she had been taught regarding his species. "Yes," he confirmed simply. "My name is Do-hyun Park, and I am not going to hurt you." She did not believe him. He could see that clearly. But she was too weak to run and too exhausted to fight. "Why did you help me?" she asked. And the question seemed genuine rather than accusatory. Do-hyun considered his answer carefully before responding. "Because you needed help," he said. That seemed like reason enough. She stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression that he could not quite identify. Then her eyes closed again, and she slipped back into unconscious sleep. And Do-hyun settled into his chair to keep watch through the night. He did not know who she was or why she had been abandoned on this moon. But he had made his choice, and he would see it through outside. The stars continued their eternal rotation, indifferent to the small act of kindness taking place in a forgotten corner of the galaxy.